All right, while folks are joining us, I will go ahead and do just a few housekeeping things, including extend a warm welcome to everyone that we have in today's meeting. If you're joining us for the first time, the University of Kentucky Sure Resource Center team is here to provide support for those at R16 eligible institutions across the country. A major piece of what we do in our training program are webinars on a bi-monthly basis, and today's session is part of that ongoing series. We do anticipate that the material presented may generate questions, and we certainly welcome you to share those at any time. We would ask that you drop those in the Q&A box, but please be patient. We'll hold all of those until the formal presentation concludes. At that point, I'll share them with our speaker and give him a chance to respond. Additionally, if you would like to go back and watch today's session at a later date, please give us 2 or 3 days to process the recording. We will upload that to our YouTube channel, and it'll be available to you very shortly. So with that, I'll extend a warm welcome to today's speaker. We have Sure Resource Center Program Director Brett Spear. He's also a faculty in the UK College of Medicine's Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics. So today he's going to speak about NIH structure with an update on the grant review process that's pending for 2025. So welcome, Brett.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So I'm looking forward to sharing with you some information about how NIH is structured and give you an update on a couple of things that are happening or are about to happen at NIH that I think are really exciting and I think are going to improve the way grants are reviewed. So what I'll do today, I've listed here, is that I want to talk a little bit about how NIH is structured. I think it's important for those of us who prepare grants and are writing grants that it's good to know, how NIH is structured so that whatever research that we're doing, that it gets reviewed by the people who are going to get most excited about our work. So I want to go over that a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about the review process itself. Once you submit a grant, what happens with that grant? How is that grant reviewed? And then once the grant is reviewed, how can you use that information to maybe improve your grants for future grants? And then talk briefly about the summary statements, what you get after a grant, and again, how you can use that effectively. And as I said earlier, I'm going to talk a little bit about some things that are happening at NIH to improve the peer review process. And I'll go through this information relatively quickly. As Melissa said, this information will be available, but I want to make sure we do have some time for some Q&A. Okay, so the first set of slides I'm going to show you just give you some websites that I think you should be familiar with, and I really encourage you to take the time after today's presentation to take a look at this information. NIH is a big organization. One thing that I think is what I like about NIH is that there's a lot of information there. You can find a lot of information about what their goals are, a lot about grants, and a lot of other information. And it really is to your advantage to become familiar with NIH. And so the links that I have here, you can look at these links later to dive in a little bit more. This is the major site. But they also have other sites as well. And so this is a link to the grants and funding. And as I said, there's a lot of really good information here. So you can look up more about grants themselves, about the processes. If you're going to think about writing a grant, get some information about some of the policies that you have to comply with if you're going to be putting grants in. There's a lot of rules and regulations about the grant. And again, some other information, not only for researchers, but administrators, and talk a little bit about some of the different types of funding mechanisms. So a lot of really good information here that you can look at. And again, another site that may be of value that digs down a little bit deeper specifically about NIH grants. This particular link talks a little bit more about the application process itself, some of the forms that are required, instructions about how you fill out these different forms that you have to do in preparation for submission. And they give you very detailed instructions. They have tutorials that can be helpful. And as I said, all the different forms and instructions for the different types of funding mechanisms can be found on this page. And you can see some of that here. Say general instructions, they have instructions for research grants, and this page actually goes on, and they talk about some of the different types of funding mechanisms as well. So take a look at these sites, become familiar with the information that's there to just become more familiar with NIH itself. Now, when we talk about NIH, keep in mind it's the National Institutes of Health. It's actually comprised of, NIH is comprised of 27 different institutes and centers, and all of them are listed over here. And again, this page goes on, but it actually gives a little bit of a description of each of the different institutes that are at NIH. And of those 27 institutes, 24 of them actually fund extramural research. And so depending on the area of research, you really want to explore these a little bit to find that institute that might be most appropriate for your particular area of research. So you can take a look at these, even though there's some similarities between the different institutes, there's also some unique features as well. So you have to, if there's particular institutes that you're interested in, you really should dig a little bit deeper so that you can understand what kind of funding or what kind of research they're really interested in and some of the different mechanisms that they support. I'll talk a little bit about these, what are called NOFOs, in a couple of minutes. These are Notice of Funding Opportunities, and these are different announcements that NIH makes about areas of research that they're particularly interested in. And by looking at this information, you can find a little bit more about the different types of, as I said, funding priorities or different funding mechanisms as well. And so this is really important to know this before we really go far with your grant proposal. And the most important thing is that you want to, really know that the project, whatever your project is, it's aligned with the Institute's mission. And so you can get some of that information by reading about those different institutes, but really what's really, really important, and you're going to hear me say this several times today, and that is that it's really important to contact people at NIH, contact program officers to discuss your projects. And as you go into these sites, you'll see information about how to contact program officers. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to talk to a program officer, tell them about your research, to make sure that they know what you want to do and they can let you know if this is something that they're interested in. And the last thing I'll say about that as well is don't assume that there's just one institute that may be interested in your research. For me, I do research on liver disease, and I'm interested in liver cancer. I'm interested in how environmental toxins affect the liver. So, most of my grants go to NIDDK, which is the institute that funds most of the liver research. But I've also submitted grants to National Cancer Institute if my research is more focused on liver cancer. If I'm looking at environmental toxins, the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences might be the most appropriate institute. So become familiar with the institutes that are in line with what your particular area of research might be. So some other things to think about when you're considering grant submissions. Every time you submit an application, it has to respond to what's called a Notice of Funding Opportunity, or a NOFO. Those of you who have done this before, this is a new term. It used to be called a Funding Opportunity Announcement, or an FOA. And your grant can be submitted as an investigator initiated, or what's called a parent announcement. This is the parent announcement for the standard R01. So if you have research that's relevant to NIH, that's health related in some way or capacity, you can submit a grant in response to this parent announcement. But some of the times institutes will issue a focused Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO. For example, let's say NIDDK might be interested in diabetes, or some health consequence of diabetes, and they say, we really want to have some research in this particular area of human health, this particular disease. So they may actually issue an announcement that might last for several years or some time limited way on a very specific area of research. And if your research falls within that area, then you might want to submit a grant in response to that notice, because a lot of times the likelihood of funding might be a little bit higher there. So it's important to become familiar with some of these different announcements, and there's different ways to do that. So how do you find information about these different opportunities? NIH does publish a guide to grants and contracts, and these are things that are available online. You can subscribe to a weekly email listserv, and I've listed that here. So this will give you regular updates about different funding opportunities that may be coming out on over time. And then you can also conduct an advanced search. So this particular link here will give you all the different NOFOs that are active at a particular time. So you can go through this and you can see if there might be a NOFO that's aligned with your research. And that information will also list the program officer for that particular NOFO. Again, contact that program officer and tell them about what you're doing, and that person can tell you whether or not they'd be interested in looking at a grant application. So keep that in mind. The one other thing I want to talk about is this NIH has something called the Reporter, and Reporter is an incredibly valuable, incredibly useful site that you can look up information about other projects that might be related to your work. And it's very user-friendly. It's very easy to go through this, and all the different grants that are funded by NIH are listed in Reporter. So you can search for different types of grants. So you can search for different projects, whether they're active or whether they're older projects. You can search for projects by the principal investigator, the organization, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different terms that you can use to look for different types of grants. And again, if you want to dig a little bit deeper, you can go into the advanced search and you can start really digging down in to look at other types of grants that might be funded that are similar to your type of work. And a really valuable aspect of Reporter is what's called Matchmaker. So Matchmaker is a way, again, to sort of find other types of grants that NIH has funded that may be similar to your own area of research. And as I said, this is all very user-friendly. So if you go into Matchmaker, what you'll have here is that you can look for similar projects, and you can input some information about your different projects. So you can input a couple of different words. If you have, say, you've developed an abstract for your work, you can put in an abstract. You can put in a specific aims page. Like many of these search engines, the more information that you put in, the more specific the information that comes out. So if you were to say, put in an abstract here and search for that, what you're going to find are a lot of other grants that are funded by NIH that are similar to your research. And it'll give you information like, well, what institute is funding your research? You can learn information about the different study sections that might be reviewing grants that are similar to your type of research. So, it's really helpful for you, because let's say that you put in your search terms, or you put in whatever input information here, and you find that most of the grants that are similar to yours are being funded, say, by the National Cancer Institute. So with that type of information, you might look a little bit deeper into NCI and talk to people at NCI about your research. So really valuable tool. This is something that I use routinely when I'm developing projects or looking for other areas of research that are similar to mine, to find the institute or different study sections that might be most appropriate for my research. Okay, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but one of the reasons I put this slide here, I just really want to emphasize that NIH has many, many, many different funding mechanisms. They have what are called R-series grants, which are research grants. They have T-series grants, the training grants. They have grants for equipment grants, for example, S-series grants. There's a lot of different types of grants that NIH has. But this is just some, not all, of the research series grants. And I've listed some links here for to dig a little bit deeper if you want to. But these are some of the ones that I would think that hopefully many of us here today might be interested in. As Melissa said, we're the SURE Resource Center here, so we focus a lot on the SURE grants. And if you are eligible, if your institute is eligible for the SURE program, I would strongly encourage you to consider the R16 grants, and particularly because the pay line for R16 grants is really quite high, much higher than a number of other different types of grants. So this, I think, is a very attractive mechanism. Again, it's for schools that have more limited NIH funding and have a significant number of students who are supported by Pell grants. So there are some restrictions, but the R16 grant is a very, I think, attractive funding mechanism. An R15 grant is similar to R16. It's for specific types of schools. Excuse me. The mirror grant or the R35 grant is something that you might not hear about, but this is a funding mechanism through NIGMS. It can be for both new investigators or established investigators. It's a little bit different than your standard research grants, but they have pretty good funding levels, and it's an interesting grant for faculty who have some innovative ideas. So that might be something you might want to think about. And then some of the sort of standard grants that a lot of people think about when they think about what are called RPG or research program project grants are the R01, R21, and R03. And so, as I said, I don't really want to go into too much detail here. We can talk more about this in Q&A if people are interested in, but the R01 is sort of the gold standard. These are relatively large research grants that can be for up to 5 years with substantial funding. R21 and R03 are smaller grants for more limited periods of time. But again, these are all different funding mechanisms that you might want to consider. But again, if you're at an institute that's eligible for R16 funding, I would definitely explore this funding opportunity. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about actually, let's say that you have a grant, you're ready to put your grant in, so you have all the papers together, all the documentation together, and you submit your grant to NIH, or I should say your institute submits the grant to NIH, because it's really the institute that is submitting the grant, and it is, if the grant gets awarded, it's actually going to be awarded to your institute, not necessarily to you. But nonetheless, when you submit a grant to NIH, a vast majority of the grants go to what's called the Center for Scientific Review, or the CSR, although some grants go directly to the institutes or centers. And once your grant goes to CSR, the first thing that'll happen is that it's going to be checked to make sure that all the documentation that's required has been included, that the formatting requirements have been are appropriate. And again, all these NIH grants require a lot of different documentation, so you really have to make sure that everything that's required is included with that submission. And the reason it's so important is because if you submit a grant and there's a document that's missing, or you don't adhere to whatever formatting instructions are there, your grant can be administratively withdrawn and it will not be sent out for review. One way to make sure that everything is correct is to submit your grant early. So let's say, for example, you submit your grant 3 or 4 days before the actual deadline. If there's some type of error, then you'll find out about that error, and you'll have some time to fix it and then resubmit it before the deadline. But if you're submitting your grant at the last minute and there's not time to check whether or not there's errors or not, if it turns out that some document is missing, but it's past the deadline, then your grant's going to be administratively withdrawn. So submit early whenever possible, but make sure that all the documentation is there. Now, assuming that everything is good and the grant gets through that process, the CSR is then going to assign your application to a particular institute or center. Again, it's going to be aligned with whatever that research might be. And then within that institute or center, it's also going to be assigned to a particular scientific review group, or SRG. And we can more commonly think of SRGs as being study sections. Okay. Normally a grant is assigned to a single institute, but sometimes it can get a primary and a secondary institute assignment as well. But nonetheless, it's going to be assigned to a study section as well. And through NIH, you can find out information about these study sections. You can look at members of the study sections and so on. So, so the SRG of the study section is comprised of a chair, and that is who's a member of that study section, as well as members of that study section. And study sections come in several different flavors. There's what are called chartered study sections, and these are considered to be somewhat permanent study sections. So they are comprised of both regular members as well as ad hoc members, people that may come on and just be present for a particular one single study section, but they're not regular members, but they might have particular expertise that's necessary. If a person is a regular member, those terms are usually for 3 to 4 years. And a vast majority of R01, R21s, these types of grants are reviewed by chartered study sections. The next type are called special emphasis panels, or SEPs. And these can be one-time or recurring to review special topic applications. And then there's another component called SBIR, STTR grants that I haven't talked about, but these are some of the different types of funding mechanisms that are reviewed by special emphasis panels. And these are comprised only of temporary members that are based on whatever expertise is needed for that particular meeting. And I will point out that R16 grants all R16 grants are reviewed by special emphasis panels. And then there's other types of study sections that review, say, fellowship applications and some of the other types of funding mechanisms that I talked about. A couple of NIH people that you should be aware of. One is a scientific review officer, or an SRO. This is an NIH employee who has scientific expertise and coordinates the activities of a particular study section. So every study section will have an SRO, they'll have a chair, and then they'll have the members of that study section. And again, the SRO is not involved with the review process itself. It's the committee will do the actual scientific review, but the SRO will make sure that everything is done appropriately by NIH regulations. And then a program officer is also an NIH employee, and this is the person that's actually going to administer grant portfolios for some of the different programs for the different institutes. So just a little bit more about the R16 grants. Any research area that's relevant to NIH in terms of the R16 grants will be reviewed by NIH. Now, those grants that are in line with the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, or NIAID, will be reviewed by NIAID. All other applications will be reviewed by the NIGMS, or National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. Now, as I said, regardless of the area of research, if it's relevant to NIH, it'll be reviewed by NIGMS. So if, let's say that you're doing aging research, don't be concerned about the fact that the National Institutes of Aging does not involve with the review process itself. It'll be reviewed by NIGMS, and it'll get a good review. So any area of research is appropriate. Okay. And as I mentioned, all NIGMS grants are reviewed by special emphasis panels. So your grant gets assigned to a particular study section. Study sections can vary in number based on how many grants are going to be reviewed. I'm actually currently chair of a study section called HPBB. It's Hepatobiliary Pathophysiology. And anyway, we normally get about 90 grants for each funding cycle. And we have usually between about 22 and 25 people at any given study section. So there can be a lot of reviewers on a particular study section, but the SRO will assign each grant to 3 reviewers. So each grant will get a primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewer. And all 3 reviewers are required to read their assigned grant applications and provide a very thorough review. And this review is going to include a short summary, a paragraph that indicates what they feel are the main strengths and weaknesses and whatever their overall level of enthusiasm might be. And then they're going to also score individual criteria, and I'll talk about these in a second. And they're going to use bullet points to emphasize what they feel are the strengths or the weaknesses for those different criteria. And they're going to provide an overall impact score. okay? So the individual criteria scores and overall impact scores are rated on a scale from 1 to 9. So a 1 is the best and a 9 is the worst. So what's going to happen is that all the reviewers are going to be looking at these grants individually, so they don't know what the other reviewers might be thinking, and they're going to give an overall impact score. So if a grant gets an overall impact score from the 3 reviewers, say of 2, 3, and 4, then the average score is going to be 3 for that grant. And then the SRO is going to take all the grants in that study section and look at those scores, and they're going to basically divide the grants in the top 50% that got the best scores, and then the lower 50%. And those grants that are in the top 50% will actually be discussed at the study section. And then those in the lower 50% will not be discussed. Okay, and we'll go into what happens with that in a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes. So that's pretty much how the initial phase of the review process goes. And I will say, all study section members do have access to all grants, unless there's some particular type of conflict. So if a grant comes into my study section from University of Kentucky, I can't be involved with looking at that grant because obviously I have a conflict. So reviewers can look at other grants, but the process of reviewing grants it takes a lot of time. So in practice, I think the members, study section members, probably spend most of their time, if not all their time, only reading their assigned grants, and may look at a few grants that they have a particular interest in otherwise. So that's what happens before the study section meets. And then, well, before I go into that, let me again talk a little bit more about these individual criteria. So reviewers are required to look at these 5 different areas. Significance: does the project address an important clinical or scientific problem? Okay. What about the investigators? Are they qualified to carry out the proposed work? If they're co-investigators, is there strong rationale? Do the people have the experience to carry out the research? And if you're an early stage investigator, a new investigator, or maybe you're at an institute that doesn't have a lot of the equipment necessary to carry out proposed studies, maybe you can have a collaborator from another institute that has experience or some technologies or equipment that is necessary to carry out your grants. So co-investigators can really be important. Another criteria is innovation. Is your application or your proposed experiments innovative, whether it's conceptual or technical innovation? Approach. The experiments that you propose, is this going to move the field forward in a substantial way? Are you using state-of-the-art technology? If there are pitfalls, have you addressed these pitfalls and considered alternative approaches? And are you using rigorous, statistical analysis? Okay. And another component is, particularly for the R16 grant, is the student involvement plan. Are the students going to get a good, meaningful research experience? And then finally, the environment. Do you have the resources and equipment to carry out the proposed studies? And do you have colleagues that you can talk to that'll be relevant for your research as well? So these are the 5 individual criteria. And I emphasize investigators and approach because I think these are the really 2 areas that really drive the review. These are what most reviewers really consider to be the most important aspects of a grant application, and what they really weigh heavily. And as I said, scoring from 1 to 9. So, obviously you're looking to hopefully get scored in the high impact, the exceptional, outstanding range. Grants that are scored in this area tend to do well, and grants that are scored in the lower numbers don't do as well. You don't all have to get 1s and 2s for a grant to be in the funding range, okay? But you really, hopefully, most of the reviewers will score you up in this area for grants they're going to be competitive for funding later on. So those 50% of the grants that are actually going to be discussed at study section, when study sections are meeting in person, these are just some pictures from study sections. All the reviewers are sort of sitting around a table. There might be other people in the room, maybe program officers or other people from NIH might be in the room as well, but they're sort of sitting on the sidelines. And when the reviewers are sitting around the room, they're discussing the grants in some random order for those 50% that are going to be discussed. Okay, so the grants are discussed independently. At the beginning of the study section meeting, if a particular person has a conflict for a grant, they have to leave the room. The chair of the study section will ask the first reviewer, actually all three reviewers, simply to give their impact score so the whole panel gets an idea of the level of enthusiasm for those reviewers. And then the review begins. So the first reviewer will give a brief summary of the grant, and then will highlight what he or she thinks are the strengths and weaknesses. And then this is followed by the secondary and the tertiary reviewer. And again, the secondary reviewer will describe what they think are the strengths and weaknesses. And if they're the same, then they don't really have a lot to say, but they may bring up other points that the first reviewer didn't bring up, and the same is true for the third as well. So all three reviewers have a chance to give their review of what they think about the strengths and weaknesses of the grants. And then the grant is open for discussion, and other members of the panel can ask questions. They might have looked at the grant a little bit, or may have some comments as well. So that can be very active discussion among other members of the review panel about that grant application. But at some point, the review has to end. And at that point, the chair then asks the three reviewers for their final impact score. And based on that discussion, that final impact score could change. Maybe a reviewer started off giving a grant of 5, but they heard some positive comments from some of the other reviewers or from the discussion, and they may decide that maybe the grant deserved to have a 4 or 3. Or maybe they were enthusiastic, but they heard some concerns that they weren't, really didn't consider, and their enthusiasm might go down. So that final impact score could change. Now, once those three reviewers give their final impact score, everyone on that panel scores that grant. So whether you were the reviewer or not, everyone gives a score, whether you're a permanent member or an ad hoc member, and all the scores are weighted equally. So it's generally expected that if whatever that range of scores for those three reviewers are, that you're going to vote inside the range. So if the three reviewers after discussion come up with review or impact scores of, say, 3, 4, and 5, you're expected to vote within that range. It can be, if you're a little on the high side, you might give it a 3, or you might give it a 5 if you're on the lower level of enthusiasm. If you feel very strongly that, there were some real flaws in the grant that others didn't feel were significant, you can vote outside the range. But if you do so, you have to tell why you voted outside the range. And that pretty much concludes that scoring of that particular grant. Now, after the grant is scored, there's some other issues that are considered, but these don't play into the actual impact score itself. And I just want to emphasize real briefly that for R01 grants, that NIH prioritizes what are called new investigators or early stage investigators. So if you fall into these categories, and if you're going to be submitting an R01 grant, you want to make sure that NIH knows that you're either a new investigator or an ESI. Okay, so again, I've gone over a lot of these, so I'm not going to take a lot of time, but the score driving issues, these are the 5 criteria. Investigators and approach are really important, and the student plan for R16 grants. There are other issues that influence the score, but they're not specifically or scored individually. If it's a clinical trial, the timeline, sex is a biological variable, whether it's human subjects or if you're doing vertebrate animals. If you're working with biohazards, if the grant is a resubmission, how you dealt with the criticism of the original grant. So these all, they're not scored individually, but they can influence the overall score. And then there's certain non-scored issues that I've listed here, including budget. So budget, the review panel does not worry about budget. That's not the concern. But if the review panel feels like you're excessive in the amount of funding that you request, they can recommend that maybe budget should be adjusted. I really want to emphasize here, when you're putting your grants together, don't think that a grant that has a lower budget has a higher likelihood of getting funded, because it won't. Whatever funding you need to carry out your work, this is what you should request, okay? Don't be greedy, but don't think that asking for less money is going to be helpful as well. Okay, so after the study section, what'll happen? Well, normally what'll happen is within a couple of days after that study section, you'll get an email that'll give you whatever your impact score is, okay? If it was an outstanding grant, you might get an impact score, say, of 15 or so, maybe an average between 1 and 2. So if it was didn't get reviewed very well, maybe it was a 5 or a 6. Okay, but you'll have that information. Some grant panels actually will also give what is called a percentile. So they'll take the grants and they'll actually give them a percentile based on their ranking, and that percentile can tell you a little bit of information as well. So once you get that initial email, you get a little sense for whether or not, well, first of all, if your grant was even discussed, because maybe your grant was not discussed if it was in the lower 50%, or if it was discussed, you will get that number, and you'll get a sense for maybe whether there's high enthusiasm or low enthusiasm. But then about a month after that, you will actually get your summary statement. And that summary statement will include all the information that those 3 reviewers, they will give their overall summary, and you'll get your bullet points for those 5 criteria score that I mentioned. So you'll, regardless of where your grant was scored ultimately, you'll see what the reviewers felt were the strengths and weaknesses of your grant. Okay. If your grant was discussed, you'll also get your summary statement will include a brief summary of that discussion as well. So a lot of information that's in that summary statement. And if your grant is not going to be funded and you want to consider resubmission, that summary statement can really be valuable to help you think about how you're going to strengthen your grant. Now, if you're not familiar with looking at summary statements a lot, have a colleague that has some NIH expertise that you're confident is going to give you some honest feedback, to take a look at that summary statement with you, to give you some of their thoughts. Sometimes you have to read between the lines a little bit with this. I know when I was first getting summary statements back, I would share them with some of the senior faculty in my department, and they saw things, or they could see things that I really just did, I was too naive to really understand. So have someone take a look at that grant with you. It can really be helpful. I mentioned the fact that 50% of grants that get submitted don't get discussed. Just because your grant was not discussed doesn't mean that there's no hope. It still may have merit. If there's certain concerns that the reviewers had that you can fix, maybe you can turn that grant around. I've submitted a lot of grants in my time as a faculty member, and I've had 2 grants over that time that went from being not discussed the first time around to actually being funded the second time around. So if you can fix the grant, then you really should talk about trying to resubmit that grant. We have a number of different of our presentations that are available on our YouTube channel, and one of the presentations that's on our YouTube channel is about resubmission process. How do you look at that summary statement, and what things to think about for resubmission? And I would suggest you take a look at that if this is of interest to you. And after you get that summary statement, you see what some of the flaws are, see what some of the concerns are, contact the program officer. That person's name is going to be listed on the top left of that summary statement, and contact that program officer and talk to them. And they may be able to tell you things that you should think about in terms of resubmission. And that discussion can really be valuable. So once again, contact program officers to talk about your research. That can be so valuable, to get your grants funded. Okay, so keep that in mind. Prepare for that discussion. Email before calling. Don't cold call. Just email to see if you can set up a time. And then, as you prepare for that discussion, have some specific questions that you can ask so that you can get some specific answers. Okay, so those are most of the things I wanted to really talk about with the review process itself, but I want to take the last couple of minutes before we get into QA and talk about the review process. So is the review process perfect? Like many processes, it probably can be improved. Anytime you have sort of human involved with the process, or with any type of thing, there could be, personal biases that are involved, and NIH understands this, okay? And so I think, NIH is doing some things to try to improve the review process. And I really applaud NIH for doing this. I think it takes, change takes time, but I think these changes ultimately are going to really improve the process. And I think it's going to really level the playing field for us who are trying to submit grants. So one thing NIH is doing is trying to reduce bias, okay? So all NIH reviewers are now required to take what are called reviewer integrity training, as well as bias awareness and mitigation training. I've taken this training. I think it's really good. And early indications from NIH is that this training is having an impact. So, what do we talk when we say bias awareness? What is this bias? Well, maybe a grant comes into the study section from Harvard. And people assume, well, gosh, if a grant's coming in from Harvard or Stanford, these premier research institutions, it must be good. And that's a bias. It doesn't, good grants come from everywhere. Why should a grant that comes in from Stanford or Harvard be better than a grant that comes in from University of Kentucky? So, this bias awareness to don't assume just because the grant is coming from an institution, it's got to be better than any other grant. Maybe a grant comes in from a person who's a member of a National Academy of Science and has a long history of successful research career. Just because the grant comes in from a person like that, does that mean it's got to be a great grant? Not necessarily, but sometimes people have these biases. So this training, so this bias awareness, I think, is really going to help reviewers do a better job of trying to negate their biases that they have in trying to carry out a fair review. So that's one thing NIH is doing. NIH is diversifying review committees. So review committees used to be quite biased towards, the typical, people that had, full professors, people who were, very well-established investigators, the white males, all these types of things that we see. And now NIH is really committed to diversifying review committees so that we're getting more men, we're getting, not more men, we're getting women, we're getting underrepresented people, we're getting assistant professors and associate professors. So they're really trying to diversify review committees so that they're getting input from people at all different levels and all different types of backgrounds. And again, I think that's going to really help the review process and make it more fair to all of us. And then the final thing is NIH is simplifying the review criteria. And so for grants that are submitted starting in January of 2025, rather than those 5 different review criteria, there's only going to be 3. Importance of research. So this is basic combining significance and innovation, scored on a scale from 1 to 9. Rigor and feasibility, scored 1 to 9. And then expertise and resources, which is sort of the equivalent of investigators and environment. This is simply going to be satisfactory or unsatisfactory. Does your institute have the resources and the expertise to carry out the experiment? So whether you're at Harvard or at University of Kentucky, if you have the expertise and carry out the equipment, it's satisfactory. Okay, so again, trying to reduce this bias that might occur. So these 2 criteria, and when I hear NIH talk about this, the 3 things they talk about is, should the research be done? Can the research be done? And will it be done? So these are the things that they want reviewers to think about in reviewing grants. And they want to sort of take away that bias that can influence investigators maybe inappropriately. So it's going to really be interesting to see how this all plays out, but I think it's really going to be helpful. And then there's going to be some changes in the unscored criteria as well. So, for example, reviewers aren't going to have to worry about study timeline or inclusion of subjects, and if there's human subjects things. Again, just so that reviewers can focus more on the important things and not worry about some of the less important things. So the goal here is to reduce reputational bias, as I talked about a little bit, help reviewers to focus on the research itself. I think that's going to really be important. And the last part of this, I think, just to remind you, is that the application process itself is not going to change. You're going to still, prepare your grants the same way as you always do. It's just the reviewers are going to look at things a little bit differently. Okay. So again, just one final point about the review process. What can you do to make sure that, to improve your grant, to make sure that it's reviewed well and fairly? First of all, understand NIH and utilize the resources and information, some of the stuff I talked about earlier. Talk to your program officers before you submit. They'll let you know if there's an interest in your research, and if maybe their institute or their study section is not the most appropriate, they can direct you to the one that is. If you have colleagues that you know that are going to give you honest opinions and have some NIH experience, talk with them about your grants before submitting them. Have them read your grants and give them, get their input about your grants before you submit it, so that if through their experience, they may help you improve your grant. And finally, if you are ever asked to participate in a study section, no is not an option. You have to say yes, okay? Maybe if your grant was submitted to a study section, an SRO might contact you and ask you if you'd be willing to serve on that study section. If asked, you will say yes, okay? Because it's incredibly valuable experience. You can volunteer. Maybe you're at a meeting and there might be a person from NIH at your meeting. You can tell that person you'd be willing to serve on a study section. And they also, NIH now has what's called an early career reviewer program. And I've listed the link here. Again, I don't have time to talk in detail about it, but this is a program for people who are interested in serving on study sections. You can sign up for study sections, and all review panels now have to have at least 2 early career reviewers on that study section. And again, that experience of being on a study section is so valuable to help sort of understand the process and learn ways to improve your grantsmanship. Okay, so my final thoughts, getting reviews back on a grant can really be challenging. You put your heart and soul into a grant, you work on it for months, you send it in, and you get an email back that tells you that your grant was not discussed, and that can really set you off. I tell people that if I get that email on a Friday, I never look at it, because I just don't want to go into the weekend finding out that my grant was not discussed. I'll wait till a Monday. So it's a process. It's a tough process. You have to have thick skin. But I will say that, and sometimes I think we feel that reviewers are out to get us. They're always looking for flaws in a grant. But my experience is that this is not what happens. I think reviewers really aren't to destroy your grant. Reviewers aren't allowed to use the F word when grants are being discussed. So if anyone says funding, the SRO or the chair will stop them in their tracks. Say, we're not here to discuss funding. We're here to discuss the scientific merit of a grant. It's up to NIH to decide whether or not they want to, fund that grant or not. Okay, but reviewers know that the funding climate is challenging. Reviewers are trying to get their own grants funded. Okay, so reviewers understand that the scores that they give are really going to impact the outcome of that particular grant, and they're simply doing their best try to find the grants that are going to significantly move a particular field forward. So try to maintain a positive attitude, be persistent, even though sometimes you're going to have challenging moments. And I've listed here a couple of additional resources about the grant review process. Actually, NIH has a couple of mock review panels. If you want to sort of get a better sense of what happens at those panels, you can take a look. And then I've listed some additional resources here that you might want to be interested in. Some of these I've talked about already. Again, sign up for some of these things through NIH to keep up with events and things that are happening. I think these can be really valuable. Like I said, the SURE program, I think, is a very exciting new program that we're certainly involved with here. This is a link for the SURE program itself. The SURE grants come in 2 flavors. The SURE grants for people who have had some funding in the past, SURE First grant for newer investigators. These are the links for these 2 funding mechanisms that you can explore in a little bit more detail. And with that, I will stop my sharing and we'll open this up for Q&A.
All right, thanks, Brett. So we have several questions in the Q&A box already. I'll start at the top, but folks are welcome to add more as we go through these. First question says, are PIs eligible to apply for MIRA ESI if they receive a SURE award?
I am not 100% sure of the answer to that question. I think that if you're near the, I don't know. I think if you have already have an NIH grant, you're not eligible for an ESI. You might still be eligible for a MIRA. I don't know, Melissa, if you know that, but my feeling is that you probably want to contact the program officer to find out for sure on that one.
Yeah, I would agree that your guess is probably correct, but again, always a great idea to verify with program staff.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question says, why does R16 ask for a student involvement plan? Is it default that the funded research will mainly be done by students advised by the PI?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, the R16 mechanism sort of has three main criteria. One is to support meritorious research. So they want faculty to be doing good research. They want to, strengthen the research infrastructure at that person's institution. But the third thing is that they really want students to have a meaningful research experience. They feel part of the R16 program is to prepare the next generation of researchers. So they really want to emphasize that the students are getting a meaningful research experience. And this is something with some other mechanisms as well, but they really seem to be emphasizing this with the R16 program. So that it's part of the research strategy itself. It's normally, you should think about it being maybe a third to a quarter of a page in length. So it doesn't have to be real long, but just a little discussion about, first of all, how you're going to recruit students into your lab, and they're always interested in underrepresented students. And then once the students are in the lab, what kind of research are they going to be doing? And again, they part of this is to find and to train the next generation of scientists to keep science moving along.
Okay, great. The next question asks, why are NIAID R16s reviewed differently? And does that change either an increase or a decrease in the chance for funding of an R16 that is within the purview of NIAID?
Right. For the first part of the question, I don't know the decision making at NIH that sort of decided that NIAID is going to review their grants in their area and NIGMS was going to do all the others. So I can't answer that. I don't know the discussions that went on at that level at NIH. So that's for sure. In terms of the funding, I can't say for sure for that. My understanding is that the success rate for NIGMS funded grants is better than NIAID. And I can say for NIGMS last year, the funding rates for the SURE grant was 44%. And for SURE First, it was about 48%. So those are really, really good funding rates. I don't know exactly what they are for NIAID, but they are not that high. I can say that.
Yeah, I'll just add they're much lower. NIH does publish that sort of data. So if you do a Google search for NIH success rates, you can click on an Excel sheet that will show you the differences between the two.
Yeah, yeah, you can look it up, but I bet it's probably substantially lower.
I want to think it's like 15% or something in that ballpark. So it's substantially different.
Yeah.
Okay, the next question says, I am the PI of a SURE First Award. Do you recommend me to apply for a standard SURE as the next step and then a MIRA ESI in the future? Would that be a smoother transition from a relatively small grant to a major one?
I would recommend that you if you haven't done so, to look very carefully at the MIRA grants themselves. MIRA grants are unusual. You don't have a specific aims page on a MIRA grant. It's a little bit it's just different in terms of how you structure the grant. You don't have defined aims. It's more the sort of the research proposals are sort of more global rather than specific. So it's a very different beast, I would say. And so I think the first thing is whether or not the kind of research you're doing really fits into what that MIRA category is. And I think that would be my first suggestion, so that you get a sense for what might be what fits best for your research, and then knowing that what's the best way forward. But there are people at NIGMS that really that manage the MIRA program, and again, I would say that those are the people you really want to talk to get that information.
Next question says, I am reviewing a NOFO and am looking for contact information for a program officer. Will this actually be listed on the published NOFO?
All NOFOs should have a program officer. Normally, you'll have to scroll to the bottom. Sometimes these NOFOs can be pretty lengthy. But normally by the time you get to the bottom of that NOFO, there should be a contact person. And sometimes there are several contact people that are listed. But there should be at least one program officer. Sometimes they might also have, say, a grants management specialist, someone who knows a little bit more about the financial aspects of the grant. But there should, at least at the bottom, there should be a program officer listed.
Yeah, it's usually section 7 and it will say agency contacts and typically has a wide variety of people who might be worth contacting. Okay, next question says, I do cancer research, although I want my R16 to be assigned to NIGMS, but it went to NCI. Of all of the 194 R16 awards, NCI awarded none. NIGMS has 170. My question is, should I avoid R16 if I'm doing cancer research?
So, you know, I guess I'd have to know a little bit more about this. No, so what NIGMS will do is that they will review a grant, and if they decide that they want to consider a grant for funding, then they'll reach out to a sister institution. So they might reach out to, say, NCI and say, listen, we have a grant that we feel is meritorious and we want to consider for funding. It's in your area. Would you want to consider funding it? And then NCI can make the decision whether they would be interested or not. And if NCI may be interested, then they have an opportunity to sort of pick it up and put it in their portfolio. And if they don't, then NIGMS will go ahead and fund it. So I don't, you know, the fact that none of the existing R16 grants, you know, have been funded by NCI, you know, that makes me wonder whether or not maybe NCI is not really interested in the R16 program at this time. But I don't think it's going to impact the likelihood of funding. If it gets a meritorious score, then I think NIGMS will fund it. So I guess my feeling is I would not, you know, avoid R16s because of that. My guess is that if you were to look at the grants, there's probably a lot of, well, I know that there's a lot of cancer grants that are funded through the R16 program, and they're funded by NIGMS. So I wouldn't give up on the R16 program itself yet, but you know, again, you could talk to a program officer to maybe, you know, explore this a little bit more, but I don't think it's going to have a negative impact on your grant. I think NIGMS, if the science is solid and it got a good score, I think they'll pick it up regardless of the area.
All right, the next question is asking, what is the best way to argue that a proposal will be done as a new investigator with less experience?
Yeah. So, Ian, if you're a new investigator and you don't have experience, if you don't have a funding record, you know, the Sure First application, you know, is very attractive. You know, for a Sure First grant, preliminary data is not required. It's always nice to have data if you have something, even if it's sort of feasibility data. So, you know, that's one thing. I think that with a Sure First, that you're going to have a mentor, and letters from the mentor to make sure that you're going to really get good mentoring can really be helpful for that as well. So I think you really, you know, have to write a really, you know, a very well-written grant is important. If you have some feasibility data, but again, data is not required there. Hopefully you've had some good training so that you have some experience, whatever area of research, to show that at least in the past you've been able to do, that you have the technical skills to carry things out. I think you really want to emphasize that.
Okay, the next question asks, can you submit a Sure First R16 and an R35 MIRA ESI at the same time? Second part of the question, what if you have an existing R16? Can you still apply and get the R35?
Right, and I think you would want to contact your program officer to find out specifically about that. My understanding is that for the MIRA ESIs that you can submit the same project as a MIRA and maybe an R01 grant. I think it can be submitted for two different things. I don't know if you can do a MIRA and a SURE first, but I think with the MIRA ESI that you can submit it in several different ways. Keep in mind that the format of a MIRA and a R16 are very different formats, so they'd have to be restructured. But I would still say that's probably a question that you'd want to ask program people at NIH.
All right, next question for the SURE R16. Should I contact a program officer before submitting the proposal?
I think it's always a good idea. You know, talk to that person, tell them what you're thinking about. You know, you might even share your abstract or aims page with the person and get their input. I think that's always a good idea. And keep in mind, don't feel as though you're a burden to the people. One of the jobs, the main job of a program officer is to be the interface between NIH and investigators. It's their job to look at your research. It's their job to talk to you about their research and to give you that advice. So you're not a burden. They're doing their job when they communicate with you.
All right, next question says, from a previous submission, the reviewers mentioned in the summary statement that I didn't have a data management plan in my submission. My pre-award officer who helped me with the submission shared with me the screenshot showing that we did submit it. In situations like this, what can I do?
I wish these things didn't happen. I know they do. We hear these stories. I would contact your program officer and tell them, you know, share this information with the program officer. You know, you can request, you know, or challenge, you know, things if it, you know, in the review process, if you feel there was something that was done unfairly and this looks like something maybe that was, and I don't know how they'll respond to it, but I would definitely alert them to this situation and so that they're aware of it, and if they choose to, they can maybe act on it.
Okay, the next question says, the budget for the R16 has created challenges. 6 months of a faculty member's time plus fringe plus indirect cost does not leave much for supplies and student wages. What are others doing to overcome the challenge? I hate to tell faculty that they cannot pay themselves over the entire summer.
Right. So the yearly max for the R16s is $125,000, and they do require 50% of a faculty member's time, and like I said, with fringe that can add up quite a bit. Now the indirects are not part of that 125,000. Okay, so well, I shouldn't pull that. The fringe benefits for the faculty member, that probably has to go into the grant, but the indirect costs are not part of that 125. So take the indirect cost out and then see what the numbers are. And, you know, that could give you a little substantially more funding. So that's one thing to think about. But yeah, that, you know, you still have to work in that budget of 125. Now, institutions do have the option of covering some of the faculty members' salary. I don't think that we would be allowed to do that at UK. If I want to put 20% or whatever percent effort on a grant here at UK, they're going to expect me to get it off the grant. But that might be one way to free up some costs, so that there would be, you know, the institution would share some of the budget. Some of the faculty costs, but I would say if you're looking at indirect costs, take that indirect costs out of that 125, and that's probably going to free up a significant amount of money. Anything else, Melissa? From you do these?
Yeah, so the last part of this question was about not being able to pay faculty over the entire summer, and I would say that we frequently see SURE First applications budget all 3 summer months to help meet that 50%, 6 months commitment.
Okay, yeah.
All right. The next question is asking about whether there's any sort of information about a cutoff score that would ensure funding for an R16.
It's just hard to say with R16 grants, because what you get is you'll get an impact score, an overall impact score, but it's not, you just don't know what that score means. So, you know, if you get a 20, does that mean, oh my gosh, that's a great score, it's going to get funded? It's hard to know. And if you get a 50, you might think, well, 50 is not fundable, but you never know. You know, I think it's just hard to say. You can talk to program officers, but they're always very cautious about trying to say, oh, this grant's going to get funded or not, because, you know, until NIH makes that final decision, they just don't know. So there is no specific cutoff, and I understand that that's a challenge, but that's the way it is, and that's the way these R16 grants are scored.
Yeah, I mean, I can add something to that. Sorry for being late. I had a lengthy other meeting, but when the way that I've heard program officers describe this sort of situation where they don't have a percentile ranking or it's not a hard cutoff, they look for what they would consider to be something has passed peer review, so it got a fundable score. So that might be, it's probably somewhere less than 50, right? And then this is potentially fundable. And then they base their decisions around what their programmatic objectives are. So, I mean, if you get a perfect score, you're almost certainly funded, but it's not guaranteed. So it might be that, you know, maybe they've put too much resources into one geographic area and they want to spread them out. But generally speaking, a really, really good score will usually get funded. Right. But the best way to do this is to talk to the program officer, because they're going to be very honest with you. I mean, they'll tell you that the likelihood, they won't be able to guarantee anything, but they'll tell you that they are going to recommend this one for funding, or they're not sure until they talk to the director. Maybe they're not going to put anything in writing for you, but they'll usually give you a kind of a range. That's been my experience anyway. They'll certainly tell you if it's a no.
Well, I'm not so sure that my experience.
Really? I mean, I've never gotten a squishy no. It's always like no. No.
Well, I hear things like they'll say, you should consider resubmission.
That's what I mean by it. That's a no.
So, but again, you know, so don't try to overinterpret it, but it is a frustrating part. We have a lot of people we work with that say, I just got a 35 on an R16. What does that mean? Well, we don't know. Maybe it'll get funded, but you're going to have to wait and see. So
I'll tell you something very similar to that, because for the yes or no, one grant that I had some years ago, back in 2015 or 16, I had not gotten a notice of award or anything from the funding agency, and it was coming right up to the deadline for when I would need to resubmit for an A1. And the program officer was not responding to me. And eventually I called and left a message and said, what should I do with this? Should I resubmit? And she sent me an actual email back that had 3 words in it. It just said, do not resubmit.
Yeah.
So I said, oh, okay, I guess that means it's going to be funded. But she didn't say that.
yeah.
So, and I thought that was very bold of her to put that in writing, because usually they would not do that. But
yeah,
that's as close to yes as you're going to get.
Yeah. What's next, Melissa?
All right, next question says, does the SURE program allow a SURE First PI to request a diversity or administrative supplement?
Yes. Talk to your program officer, but they do allow supplements. Talk about specifically what it is, and that person can tell you.
Okay, next question says, if I'm the PI on an active R15 grant that will be completed by the end of August, am I still eligible to apply for an R16 grant now for the May deadline?
I would think, since by the time the R16 would be funded, the R15 will end. So since you're in the last year of that grant, you should be eligible for an R16 submission.
Last year is allowable. Yeah.
The last year is allowable. Mm-hmm.
All right, next question says, my research is HIV related. It is more of basic mechanism. Where will my SURE First application go? do I have to follow the HIV grant cycle deadlines?
I would think if it's HIV related, even if it's basic mechanisms, but HIV, I would think you'd follow that deadline.
Yeah, is there not a thing in the NOFO specifically for that, for HIV related? I thought there was.
There are HIV and related project deadlines in the SURE NOFOs.
Yep.
Yeah, so follow those.
All right. Next question says, if I am in a minority serving institute, but I am not a minority PI myself, does that prevent me from applying and being considered for an R16?
If you're at anyone who's at an R16 eligible institution can apply. No restrictions on the faculty.
Right. And I would just add that not all R16 eligible institutions are minority serving. All right. Next question says, I have one R15 under review, and I did submit an R16 SURE application this week. If the R15 is funded, does it mean I have to withdraw the R16 application?
If your R15 gets funded, I doubt that they're going to fund your R16. If you get a really good score, you maybe try to negotiate, but my feeling is that if your R15 is funded, then you would no longer be considered for R16 funding.
All right, next question is asking if you have any recommendations about deciding between an R15 or the R16 mechanism. Well,
I'm a little biased towards R16, but I think there are some things to think about for the R16. It's 4 years of funding rather than 3 with the R15 mechanism. The pay lines are substantially better for R16 than they are for the R15 grant. R15s are dependent on the different institutions, and the pay lines differ, but they're going to be considerably lower than the R16. So I think those are some real strengths that the R16 program has over the R15 program. And the amounts don't really change. It's R15 $300,000 for 3 years, R16 for sure it's $400,000 for 4 years. So yeah.
I would add 2 things. R15s allow for clinical trials and R16s do not. So if that applies to you, that's a big point to consider. And the eligibility criteria are different. So it may be prudent to check and see if your institution is eligible for both before making a decision as well.
I'll add one last thing, which comes up a lot, and that's the review process is a little bit different. So the R15s are reviewed in a different context than the R16s are. So there's a larger, R16s are reviewed as a group. So you're being compared to other R16s, even though when an R15 is in another study, in a standing study section, there may be only a few of those. So you don't have as large a cohort for comparison. And the context can actually hurt you.
Okay, the next question says, I'm an experienced investigator moving into a minority institution. I've had small funding before, so an AHA Career Development Award, but not an NIH grant. Do you recommend applying for a SURE First or a standard SURE R16? And will the reviewers think I still need mentoring?
Well, so if you've had as a PI, if you've had a externally funded peer-reviewed grant, and American Heart Career Development sounds like that type of grant, then you're not eligible for SURE First. In that situation, you'd want to look at a SURE grant. So NIGMS is very strict about this thing with SURE First, that even if it's a small externally funded grant, if you've had something that's even small, they're probably not going to consider, they won't consider that for SURE First. So I think you're in a position looking at the SURE grant.
Okay, the next question says, I have submitted an R35 MIRA application and it was returned because the proposal was considered to be related to disease. Actually, I used patient cell lines carrying mutation as research materials to understand the roles of a gene in the regulation of a biological process. How to address this issue if I want to submit again.
That is something that's typically addressed by talking to the program officer to make sure that it's within scope of what it is that they'll consider. I mean, a lot of things for general medicine, right? They're looking for basic things. So you have to, yes, it can be disease relevant, but it has to be the pitch of the project is much different. And that's a conversation with the program officer. Brett, do you agree?
I would agree.
Next question is asking if you can speculate on how a potential increase in the number of R16 applications might impact success rates for the program.
Well, one never wants to predict the future. However, we have heard NIH people specifically say that they would like to keep that funding rate for SURE grants at least 40%. So I maybe it's going to go down even if from where it is now, but I think it's still going to be the number is going to be attractive. Yep.
Okay, next question says, if I get a SURE first R16, can I then submit an R01 during my first year of R16 funding?
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep, I would say that the folks at NIH would
like
love
that.
to see. Yeah, love
But
to
it will, if you get the R1 funded and it's in the same thing, it would end up your SURE reward would end up ending.
It's in the same topic.
Yes, unless if they're totally different, then you could have both.
Yeah. But you're going to want to have a pretty mature, substantial preliminary data, so on and so forth for an R01 grant. So make sure that, you have a pretty robust program with good preliminary data for the R01. Yep.
All right. Did either of you see any questions that we missed? As we scan, if anybody has a question they want to ask out loud, you can use the raise hand function and we can give you access to your microphone. I'll do the best I can with the names. Namita, you should have access.
Yeah, that's me, Namita. So I'm still not clear as to, my work is HIV related. So do I have to submit the R16 itself, but in September? Is that what I understand? 7th September is the deadline for our HIV grants. So I will use the R16 NFO, but submit it on 7th by 7th September. Is that what it is?
I believe the NOFO says if it's age related, it is September 7th. It looks like Melissa's looking at that right now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Looks. I also went through the NOFO, so it does say. So, yeah.
And again, it never hurts to confirm with a program officer.
Okay, I will do that.
To contact them and just to make sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
But this HIV related thing goes to NGIMS or NIID?
I don't know how they make those decisions at the level of NIH between those two institutions. So okay. I couldn't answer that question.
Okay.
Now the program officer might be able to give you some idea.
Okay. So first thing is write to the program officer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Yang, I think you should have access to your microphone as well.
My question is, my current R16 ending in May 2026. My question is, can I submit another R16 after this? If so, when I can submit the proposal? Should be one cycle before that, or when can I do that?
It's in last year, right? So that would be 2025 years if it ends in 2026.
Okay, it's 1 year before the ending of the current one.
Yeah, if you're in the final year of your current grant, then you're eligible to submit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a new question in the Q&A. It says, how long should I wait after council review? I did receive a fundable score, but I'm stressed. I did reach out to the PO, and the PO said to wait, and they will let my institute know.
Yeah,
It can be slow. I mean,
I know this is frustrating, and we've heard from other people that are sharing the same stories with us. I know it's how frustrating it is from that. I guess the other thing I do know also from NIH perspective that they're really swamped right now. I'm not trying to make excuses, but we do hear from them that it's crazy right now trying to get everything figured out for this.
it can be a few months. It is not. I mean, if you look at with my RR1, the last one, I started to go on to message boards to see what other people's experiences had been with how long they had to wait. And some people said they waited they didn't get their notice of award for like 3 months after council met. So it really depends on what their workload is like and what personnel they have for doing through, because the financial paper, it takes a while for them to do all the paperwork for this and to verify they have all the things they need.
Yeah. But I think Paul and I can say that we've shared that frustration, and it is stressful and it's hard because you're thinking about it all the time. But yeah, but we've been hearing this from several other people as well. So try to be patient.
Last thing I'll mention, there are a couple of requests for the slides. We're trying to move to getting folks to use our YouTube channel as the secondary source, just because NIH policy changes and updates so readily. So we don't ever want anyone to be working from an old set of slides. But we will send a link to the recording of today's session. And if we can provide you with direct links to some of the NIH tools and sites that were referenced, I'll be happy to do that as well. Oh, we've got another hand raised. Dr. Zhang, I think you should be able to access your microphone now too.
Sure. If I currently have an ongoing R16 grant, shall I submit a renewal application or a brand new application after the completion of the current grant?
That is an excellent question. Brent, you want to try first? And
Yeah, okay. I'll try first. If you feel like you've made good progress on your existing grant, let's say that you've got some publications that you've done well with completing your proposed studies, so that you've made good progress. If you've made good progress and you want to continue along the same lines of work, I would recommend a renewal application. If things did not go as well as you hoped, you don't have some publications, the experiments didn't turn out like you planned, maybe you're going to take a bit of a new direction, then I would consider maybe something new. Paul, what do you think?
that's a really good summary. I mean, the decision is really whether or not you were able to address each of the aims in your previous proposal, and did you make progress on them? So, if you had a publication that was applicable to each aim, so you showed that you made good progress, you have evidence of progress, then you're in an okay place. How much progress is good progress is really debatable. And that really depends on, I mean, if you have a 4-year grant and you have 4 papers, most people would consider it to be quite good.
Yeah.
Right? They're all in peer-reviewed journals. But if you only had 1 paper, but it was in a really high impact journal, that might be good enough. So really, you just have to be able to make the case, and when you're writing the progress section of the grant, that it's, that you did make good progress. It can be a tough call sometimes. I mean, a lot of people will choose to go in a different direction, put in a new grant, because it might be, for example, that your current grant, maybe only 1 aim turned out to give really exciting results, and the other aims were kind of meh. So you're like, well, I'm just going to build off of this 1 aim and write a new grant from that. And then that could work out, even if you felt the progress was okay. Because sometimes people will, say that, well, most of your previous grant didn't work. And I mean, that can be kind of unfair, but I mean, people interpret that differently. Remember, reviewers are just giving their opinion.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's everything we have in terms of questions in the Q&A or hands raised. So we'll thank Brett for an excellent presentation. And again, just give us a couple or 3 days and we'll be back in touch with access to the recording.
Bye all. Thank you.